Okay, this is a short chapter on how climate change affects mental health among humans, and it's slightly different than what is a new uh, revelation, I would say, of something called climate anxiety or eco-anxiety, which is much more about reading all the negative news or um, climate impacts happening around the world every day. Every newspaper, in every language across the world has stories on climate impacts, local, global, and so on. So many people are beginning to feel helpless and that there is nothing they can do and so on. So that's called climate anxiety. This is an article from The Guardian which goes into saying how you can take action on your own of reducing your food carbon footprint, your travel carbon footprint, your energy, your consumption, and so on, to reduce your own climate anxiety, because taking part in climate solutions on your own may help reduce this eco-anxiety or climate anxiety. But what the chapter here is focused on is much more about the other part of the physical health we have been looking at in terms of vector-borne, zoonotic, waterborne, and so on diseases, air quality related diseases, and so on related to climate change. This is a schematic of the pathways in the book, even though some of these things are not very intuitive to me, because here the black line is supposed to be where indicate increases, while blue arrows indicate decreases in variables to which arrows point. So some of them make perfect sense. Global change increases natural disasters, which would increase psychopathology, which is the study of diseases or the sum of all the diseases, including mental health, so physical and mental health. But here the blue line makes sense that climate change would reduce traditional lifestyles, but then why would it reduce psychopathology? I'm not sure. But here it's supposed to increase physical health issues, which makes sense. Climate change would reduce public health, and why would it reduce psychopathology? I'm not sure. So I will leave this here since the book doesn't really explain these links very clearly, but use some of the other schematics done by other groups like this one here. So let's look at a couple of these which are more intuitive, but these links do make sense in terms of climate change impacting resources, global conflicts, and mental health, including other healths, climate change negatively affecting landscaping, ecosystems, and affecting negatively psychopathology, and so on. So environmental, institutional. So here we are looking at climate drivers again in terms of temperature, precipitation, extreme weather, sea level rise, which we have been looking at. And there are exposure pathways which we have looked at, severity of extreme weather, climate influenced illnesses, injuries, deaths, damage to homes, livelihoods, communities, and population displacement, level of exposure to all, leading to mental health and well-being outcomes like distress, grief, depression, strain on social relationships, substance abuse, post-traumatic stress syndrome and anxiety disorders, and resilience and post-traumatic growth. And they have also relations with environmental and institutional context in which these exposure pathways and health outcomes happen, like access to mental health and social services, status of disaster, behavioral health planning, risk messaging, and communications, which becomes very critical as well to deal with the health outcomes of climate-driven negative impacts on wellness and mental health. Social and behavioral factors, of course, pre-existing mental and behavioral health conditions increase your vulnerability. Socioeconomic status provides us economic and social vulnerabilities. Family stability, community engagement, prior trauma exposure, and individual resilience are all going to determine the net outcome, as we have already seen. From the same site, we are again looking at climate impacts on ecosystems, rain, precipitation, temperature, sea level rise, wildfires, winds, storms, cyclones, etc. Affecting medical and physical health, so changes in fitness and activity level. Sometimes climate change may even make it difficult to go outside and exercise, for example, because of air pollution or heat waves and rainfall or storms and so on. Heat-related illnesses, allergies, we talked about phenology and plant responses to climate change, increased exposure to waterborne and vector-borne diseases that we talked about in terms of mental health. We already mentioned these things, and of course there is also community health, where increased interpersonal aggression, a smaller version of the increases in conflicts, increased violence and crime, increased social instability, and decreased community cohesion are also responsible for overall health outcomes, right? So this makes much more sense. We'll look at a couple of points in this chapter also, that there is gender discrimination by climate change. So women are more likely to be affected by most climate impacts on health. These are proportions of studies finding the gender most affected is male, female, or no difference. So we are looking at all the studies considered in this report here. Death and injury from extreme weather, food insecurity, infectious diseases, mental illnesses, which is the focus of this chapter, poor reproductive and maternal health. And of course this is completely a women's problem, but even in these other health outcomes you can see that women, except for the infectious diseases where men are more susceptible, almost all of the others are all disproportionately affecting women. This also extends to climate justice and other issues where disproportionate impact goes to communities which are not well off to begin with. Okay. This is looking at exposure increased by total population moving towards low elevation coastal zones. So populations towards the coasts are increasing. Looking at the baseline of 2000 for Asia, Africa, Europe, Latin America and Caribbean, North America and Oceania, as well as global, you can see that over time in the coming years and decades, with two scenarios here, looking at 2030 and 2060, global population as well as predominantly Asian and African population living in the low elevation coastal zones is going to increase, which means exposure to various sea level rise issues, storm surge, inundation, harmful algal blooms, pathogens, and impacts on water quality and so on are going to be affecting people, which typically translates from physical health to various mental health issues as well. The other issue is something we have also talked about again and again: migrations, forced migrations. This is from a World Bank report which says by 2050, if nothing is done, the people that are going to be forcefully displaced are going to be massive in millions in the sub-Saharan Africa, 86 million, South Asia 40 million, and Latin America 17 million. We already talked about how migration affects health and mental health. Looking at it again as a schematic from this infographic: migration and the social determinants of health. Conditions surrounding migration often fuel health inequities and may expose migrants to increased health risks and negative health outcomes. So there are individual factors like age, sex, and hereditary factors involved, lifestyle factors, so economic, class, cultural, or linguistic barriers, and substance abuse. Substance abuse tends to be high among poor migrant communities, which leads to other problems of locals not accepting them or seeing them as problematic, crime prone, and so on and so forth, as has happened in many countries. Living conditions, access to clean water and sanitation and safe housing can be a problem. Crowded working and living places, working conditions, access to and existence of jobs providing living wage, social and community factors, existence of discrimination, stigma, and social inclusion, and of course governance and socio-economic conditions where existence of legislation and policies affecting migrants' health may be an issue to deal with as well. More directly, this is an example of increasing dryness. So this is a drought severity becoming worse. This is an indicator of wetness and dryness. And this shows that number of refugees tends to be somewhat correlated, but total displaced people definitely tends to be correlated with this. But there are some who argue that armed conflicts and so on are maybe overestimated in terms of their relation to climate change impacts. So this map is looking at georeferenced event dataset with number of conflicts being plotted here and agricultural dependence, and seems to indicate that the relation between food security, food availability, stability, prices, etc. are not that strongly correlated with agricultural impacts because of climate change. So I'm just including it to say that attribution of conflicts to climate change can be problematic, even though there are studies that show that even temporary perturbations like El Nino lead to elevated civil conflicts and armed conflicts. So one has to worry about it, especially in a place like Syria where the war has gone on for so long. It's always been argued that it started with the long persisting drought around 2008, the Arab Spring and the food prices and so on, but now it's a complete mess in terms of the geopolitical conditions. This is just another one of the similar infographics looking at greenhouse gases manifesting in changes in climate and climate events and physical environmental impacts. I won't go into the details because we have seen these several times, but the main point of this infographic is how that affects the equity dimensions. So fairness, justice, and inclusion are severely impacted by climate change, which affects underlying nutrition drivers like food security, care capacity, health services, and water and sanitation. Immediate nutrition drivers like diet intake and health status, including food utilization that we talked about, which relates to nutrition outcomes like micronutrient deficiency, dietary diversity, undernutrition, overweight and obesity, and diet-related non-communicable diseases. Obesity, as it turns out, is a serious underlying cause for many mental health issues as well. So obesity is something that is affected by climate health. And that is also related to consumerism, because overconsumption, increased calorie intakes, lack of physical activities, etc. have been related to mental health as well. And of course, consumerism is a major underlying cause of environmental degradation as well. So that means we are kind of making in a multi-pronged attack on the environment and its feedback to health, especially mental health in this context. So this is just a cartoon from this article on how consumerism hurts mental health and the environment. But as we can imagine, consumerism is related to obesity, which is related to mental health, and consumerism is related to environmental degradation, greenhouse gas emissions, energy consumption, driving, meat consumption, and so on and so forth, which in turn feed back to all the negative impacts we are talking about here. So this is what is critical about the framework of planetary health as well, to see that we look for these linkages between our own behavior, our impact on climate, climate impact on our physical and mental health. Okay, so that's the chapter. That's an introduction to the potential relation between climate change impacts and mental health.